Welcome to another episode of the Dan Norton Show. Today, I am here with Cam. I got to know Cam through watching him on the Jubilee channel. This is a channel on YouTube which has many millions of subscribers. I came across a video within the last month or two in which I saw Cam among many other people who were debating Ben Shapiro. And contacted a few people who were involved in this debate, and Cam was one of the people who replied, and he agreed to have a conversation. So here we are. Cam, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sure
Really
thing.
excited to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So before we get into our discussion of mostly political issues, I would predict. Could you just tell my audience a little about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Cam. I run a podcast called Talk Politics with Cam. As you can imagine, we talk about a lot of politics. And so most of the things we talk about right now are why I'm so anti-Trump for president. And at least that's what we were talking about before the election. Now we're talking about all the things that are going on and how they're going to affect us now. So again, let's talk politics with Cam. And that's what I do.
All right, sounds good. And I can put a link to that in the description if anyone wants to check your workout. Okay, so let's talk some politics. I think we likely have a different view on certain issues such as taxes or regulations. I am a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophy. I don't know if you read Ayn Rand at all, but she's in favor of capitalism and how she understands that. I think that term is often misunderstood or understood in different ways, to say the least, by many people. But as she understands it, capitalism is a system in which there is no force. You can't initiate force against other people. So as long as you're not coercing anyone, you're free to do what you want, basically. So some of the implications of this viewpoint are that there would be no taxes because taxes are a case where the government is forcibly under threat of jail taking your money away. It's not up to you whether you contribute to pay taxes that will go to fund various things, education, healthcare for other people, as well as yourself. Um, you don't have a choice about this. You have to pay these or you'll go to jail. And she opposes that because she thinks people should be free to do what they want with their own money. They shouldn't be forced to use it as someone else would have them spend it. Or she's also against regulations. So, for example, labor regulations like minimum wage laws that force people to hire at a certain rate, like you have to pay $15 or you're not allowed to hire somebody. She would be against that as another type of coercion. She thinks people should be free to contract with each other and just come to a mutual agreement by voluntary means. So she's against all taxes, all regulations, and I can elaborate more on that as we discuss this further. But let me just pause there and throw it over to you and see what you have to say at this point.
Yeah, and I would never pretend to be like super well read. I'm not well read on Ayn Rand, but I appreciate the summary there, and it makes I understand the general concept: no tax, no regulation, and I get that. My only thing with no tax, no regulation, right? Everybody wants to pay less, have keep more of your money. Of course we do, but then what? So I guess would private companies provide the security, the military? Would they just fund that? Like, how do we pay for it? So I get the concept that we're forced to do it under threat of jail, but the same could be said for murder or all these other things that we've made illegal. And people can't do them. They can, and they do still under threat of jail, under threat of you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison or worse, we might execute you. So I get it. I totally do. I'm just curious though, what is the alternative? How do we then, because surely you'd agree that we have to fund the government. Like we have to pay for the roads that the we need some regulation. Like, we can't just have everybody flying in the airspace no matter what. Like, who takes care of that then if the people aren't paying for it?
Okay. So yeah, it is a very common question that comes up when I have these discussions. Like, if we don't have taxes, how are we going to pay for the government? So first of all, I'll say I do think there should be a government. I'm not an anarchist. Many people call me a libertarian, although I wouldn't call myself that because libertarians often are anarchists. They oppose the state entirely, or they think it should be privatized and you should have like competing governments. I don't accept that view. I do think there should be a government, but I think it should be funded by voluntary means. And there are various ways to do this that have been proposed, some of which are discussed in an essay by Ayn Rand. She has an article called Government Financing in a Free Society. And she mentions very briefly donations and lotteries as two ways you could fund the government. But then she discusses at greater length a third way, which involves contributing money to the government to enforce contracts. So if you do business with someone, say you're in some huge corporation and you want to contract with some other corporation, and this involves, say, hundreds of millions of dollars, you want to have this contract enforced. Well, you could pay the government a fee to have this contract enforced, and that would be one way of for the government to collect revenue. So if it's going to step in, if you make a claim, you want to sue somebody because you think there's a breach of contract, then if you want to have the government step in and actually enforce your lawsuit there and adjudicate it and award you damages if you think any have been done, then you could pay the government a fee to enforce the contracts. But historically, it's been done in other ways. There actually are, I think, state lotteries at least that fund governments. I don't know which ones there are now, like Powerball or whatever they're called. They fund these. There's these state lotteries, and you could fund some of the government functions that way, as well as just donations. And people make uh, billions of dollars of donations already today for private charities. So it's not like people are not going to donate at all. It's just a question of where are they going to put their money. And if you're already being taxed, I think you're less likely to be donating to the government on top of the money you pay them in taxes. If you weren't being taxed, then at least a portion of that money you might donate to support the government. And another point I'll make here, I'll just make this point, and then I'll throw it back to you. Um, Ayn Rand has a very restrictive view on the proper functions of government. So there's basically only three things the government should be doing, which I'll reduce to protecting you from force. So the three functions are police, military, and courts. So the police protect you from domestic criminals who would use force to interfere with your life, like robbers, rapists, murderers. So all those force initiators, the police help extract from society. And then the military will protect you from foreign threats of force, some other nation that wants to come over and conquer and enslave us. So you get the military to protect you from foreign threats of force. And then finally, the court system is a way to peacefully settle disputes between people. So just two private citizens, maybe they have a disagreement over something like, where exactly does my property end and yours begins? Well, we could have a fight and resort to fisticuffs to try to settle that, or we could try to adjudicate it peacefully. And that's what the court system allows. It's a peaceful way for people to settle their disputes, but it's again a way of extracting force from society. So if you have a much restricted view of government like that, you're not funding billion dollar programs like Medicare or Social Security or even trillion dollar programs. If you don't have, multi-billion programs like wars on drugs, wars on poverty, public education, public roads, post office, all these things the government is not going to be doing in the capitalist society Ayn Rand envisions. So there's much less to fund. So it will be much easier to fund the much smaller role of government that does exist. So that's on your question of how to fund the government without taxes. And I've been going on for a while, so let me just pause there and throw it over to you.
You bring up some great points, and I'll definitely check out the government financing in a free society. I got definitely want to read more on it because it is interesting, right? Because that does answer my question, but it's still it doesn't settle my concern. So, and I'm not oblivious to the fact that we have a spending problem. We overspend, and even if we found some other way to fund our government, it wouldn't change the fact that we still spend way too much. Like that's part of the issue. That's probably part of the reason why I feel like we can't do something like this yet. Because although donations and all of that make sense, it's still voluntary, and which means people won't do it unless you have a good message to get them to do it. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody's messaging is that great, at least on the left. The right has good messaging, but it's mostly lies. So, and or misleading on the truths of things. And so how could we get, you say the military, right? That's what the government should be doing. So are we just going to get people to donate to stop an invasion, or donate to Ukraine? Only the people who want to, only the people who support Ukraine would be donating to stop Russia from invading Ukraine. But then what if Ukraine, or what if Russia takes over something else? What if Mexico is the one that's threatening to invade us? And only the people who want to stop the invasion, the people who are well read, the people who are interested and politically literate, know that this is bad and that we should be donating to this, but they can't get the message out. Mexico invades anyway. And so are we still like, where does the voluntary portion of it end? Are you saying that the other things are voluntary, but the military and the police and the courts, we that's mandatory to spend money on and be taxed? Or again, I'll have to read, maybe she goes into it more, but is that explained? Or like, what do you understand my question? Like
Yeah, I think
where's the line drawn?
so everything is voluntary, including military, police, and courts, the three functions of government that she does think should exist. Um, and there, the concern is some people might not be informed enough or motivated enough to provide the funding that's needed to actually fund an effective military. And so, how do we ensure that if it's all just voluntarily funded? So, on this point, I I like to bring up the example of the American Revolution sometimes. So George Washington, on my reading of history, is if I believe what had a volunteer army. So these are people who were sold on the idea that Americans' liberties were being violated by Great Britain, and they didn't want to live like that. So Patrick Henry had his famous line, "Give me liberty or give me death." So these are people who didn't want to live under the thumb of Great Britain. They didn't want to live as slaves or as serfs. Um, and so they were willing to put their lives on the line in order to defend their way of life, a free society. And I think if people are willing to risk their lives to defend a free society, I think they're going to be willing to give up something much less, which is just some of their money. So I think it's in people's self-interest. This gets into morality a little bit. It's in people's self-interest to fund a free society to, and therefore I think they will. But if they don't, I think that's on them. So I don't really have sympathy for people who aren't willing to pay for their own defense. Um, so I don't think people should be getting something for nothing. Uh, I don't think people should altruistically, self-sacrificially just try to protect other people. I think people should pay for their own defense, and if they don't, there are ways you could discourage that, like social ostracism. You could boycott people who are kind of acting as free riders and they're not putting forth any contributions to the military or the police. And you could like you could boycott these people, not do business with them. So there are ways you could discourage that sort of behavior, but it would be voluntary. even the military. But I think people would, because it's in their own self-interest to have a military, I think there would be enough funding for it. And if there isn't, that's their problem. They don't have a right. You don't have a right to force anyone else to pay for their own defense. That's my view.
And I get that. That makes sense. But people vote against their own self-interest all the time, unfortunately, because they aren't informed. They don't know what they actually are voting for. So because of that, they can be sold on things happening. And while it was true what George Washington was selling, what the right is selling today is typically not true. These are the migrants eating pets people. And so they are selling things that are untrue in order to get people to voluntarily commit things like do things that aren't necessarily positive is kind of where I'm going with that. So while I get that, yes, we could pay for it with other ways, but I feel like it still would then just be privatizing the military, where you could people whoever is donating the most money, they're going to get the most say. Or they're going to get their building named after them on campus because they are voluntarily giving this money to support the military. So I don't know how. I don't know if that's going to be. I don't know how that would be any different, I guess, than right now, because it feels like the people then would lose all control. Like at least those people who, not just okay, let's say that there are those people who don't want to give money to the military, but there are also those people who don't have the funds to give to the money. Even if you take away all the taxes, they still don't know how to budget. So once it's not going to change again, they're still going to be living paycheck to paycheck, just because they have extra money. We see it all the time. They get extra money at tax time. People get extra money at tax time, and then they're still broke. They're still because their budget, their habits don't change. So I get where you're coming from, but I don't think people would still voluntarily give, and even the people who don't want to still might not, but the people who may want to but can't, like you're not going to get that money either because you're not necessarily forcing them. But then you brought up you could basically, ostracize them, which is interesting because while it's not prison, sure, isn't that just coercion? At the same point, you're basically doing the same thing. You're saying, I don't want to say forcing, but you're saying basically you're going to be, outlawed unless you submit to what we want to do, unless you give money to the military, unless you help us with this fence or whatever that's going to help you. I get it, right? It's going to help us all. But if they don't get that it's going to help them, it's not really shame on them. They didn't know when we get invaded. It's going to affect all of us. I think that's what I feel like the federal government has the responsibility to do. Protect all of us. Protect all of us, even those who disagree, even those who don't know any better. Their job is to protect all of us from the things that are that could harm all of us, every single one. But I guess so. My question then, out of all of that, isn't it basically just coercion? If you force people not by jail but by ostracizing them, isn't that coercion?
No, I don't think it is. And I I do want to add that I don't think it's necessarily the case that you're a bad person if you don't contribute. You might just be a person who's fallen on hard times. Maybe you've got a big family to support, and maybe this year you decide I'm not going to contribute. Um, so I think there can be cases where, at least temporarily, it's reasonable not to contribute. But I think, depending on how small, there's so many ways you can contribute though, in levels of contribution. So you could contribute 1 penny a year, or you could contribute $1 million a year. You could also contribute in other ways, maybe by volunteering for some service to serve on jury duty, or I don't know, some other government's function that just involves devoting some of your time rather than giving up some of your money. So there are different ways and levels at which you could contribute. Um, but I don't think it's coercion. So if it's a case where it does seem like someone is just a leech, he's not like super poor, um, and he's like a couch potato. It's not like he doesn't have any spare time. He could, volunteer an hour or something to help the government in some way. Yet he does none of that. Then I think it could be reasonable to, um, at least in your own minds, somehow ostracize this guy. Maybe, I mean, ostracism. It's kind of a strong term, but there are different levels at which you could not interact with someone. You could choose not to be their friend, not to be their business partner. Um, there are many different ways you could manifest your disapproval of their free riding. Um, but in any case, I don't think it's coercion. For it to be coercion, it has to involve some kind of physical interference. So sometimes I define it as unconsensual physical contact with a person's person or property. So, a punch in the face would be interfering with someone's person. Grabbing some of their property without their consent, that would be interfering with their property. So, unconsensual physical contact with someone's person or property is how I think of coercion. Um, and ostracism is doesn't fit that definition. So you're not using force on them. You're not having any kind of physical contact with them that's not consensual. You're just choosing not to deal with them. You might spread the word to other people. You could create a blacklist. I mean, depending on how serious the issue is. Um, so I think I have a pretty definite idea of what coercion is, and it's important that there is a definite idea of what coercion is. A lot of people will say, like, if you don't pay someone a quote living wage, you're coercing them. I think that's kind of a woozy concept of coercion that doesn't have any clear lines, and I think that can present a lot of problems if you don't have a clear definition of coercion. I think it's got to be objective, its meaning, and if it's not, um, there are problems that arise, which maybe will come up in this discussion. But just to cut it short here and throw it back to you, I'll just end by saying, no, I don't think something like ostracism or boycotting is coercive.
So do you think money is property?
Property?
Yeah. Do you think money is property?
I guess it could be. Yeah, like if it's money that you earn, so let's say you work a job and your contract says you get paid $20 an hour and you do the work, you get paid that $20. Now that money, that $20 is now yours. It's your property. Um, I guess if you I mean if someone else has done the work and they've gotten paid $20 according to their contract, and then you just take it out of their wallet without their consent, then I would say you've taken someone else's property, so you don't have a right to it yourself as the thief. But if you're the one who's earned it, then I would say it is your property.
The reason I ask is because you mentioned boycotting as a form of getting people to do what you want them to do. Like, hey, you could stop being their friend, you could stop, you know, patronizing their business. Well, that is taking money out of their pocket. You're saying, hey, we no longer want to patronize you. That's going to get them to either do what you want them to do or they're going to go out of business.
But you're not
That's,
taking money out of their pocket. You're just not putting money in their pocket.
I guess that's fair. That is fair. Is that that is the you're keeping your property as opposed to giving it away. And so I guess that is kind of a loophole to avoid the coercion, but still feels a little right, like gray area, like you're saying I don't want to force them, but we're gonna do kind of things that teeter on the brink of force, right? Like I'm not gonna hit you, but I'm gonna blow in your face a lot, right?
Well,
Like
blowing in the face, I think that could be considered
still
physical
still
contact.
still physical contact.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
or
like
like, banging a drum by their ear. Um, there's kind of there is a grayish area where it's not always like you're literally touching
yeah,
their skin with your skin, but you're like in their space or something. I don't think boycotting is in that gray area. I think it is clearly on the on the other side of the line. Um, but there are
Sure.
cases like a neighborhood HOA might have rules about nuisance laws or nuisance rules. Like if you play music outside on your patio, it can't be like above a certain number of decibels. And there can be gray areas where you just have to work it out and stipulate in the contract. Like if you want to live in this community, then these are the rules, and they specify these things, so they're not gray anymore. Um, but in any case, yeah, I don't think boycotting or ostracizing is in that gray area. I think it's clearly not coercive.
And so do you think that the amount someone donates, if you say that's voluntary to give money, do you believe the amount somebody donates should change the amount of police protection they get or the amount of say they get and what the military does? Do you believe there's a threshold, or do you believe whether somebody gets a cent, a penny a year, like you mentioned, or they give $1 million a day, that they get the same amount of treatment from the police?
I would say this is something I haven't thought a lot about, but the the little thinking I've done based on that, I would say everyone gets the same police protection and military protection, but if they want more, like private security, then they can pay for that. So like if you're a billionaire, uh, you might want private security that stays on your property 24/7 and is always monitoring what's going on your yard. Um, you could pay extra for that, but that wouldn't be a police function. That would be a function of just your private security team.
So it'd be the same as today, where the police exist, but billionaires pay for private security to go
Yeah,
with them
that's
everywhere.
that's that's how I think that would work. Yeah.
So so they wouldn't get any additional, whether you give, I mean, somebody could be funding the government, is what you're saying. Just a group of billionaires can get together and say, I know that it costs us $6 trillion to run the government. We're going to get together and pile all of our money together, even though that still wouldn't be enough, but and pile all of our money together and somehow we come up with enough to fund the government. They don't get any say in how that money is used. It's just a blind donation to, like, who? Like, is Congress, does Congress still exist? Like what who is, like, when this money is just coming in, who is using it and appropriating it, and how? Like, how are they deciding? Like, is there really no influence from the people who are giving it?
I think the again, I haven't thought much about this, but off the top of my head, my first answer to that would be no, they don't have like an extra amount of influence or say in how the money is spent, even though they're giving the lion's share of the money. Um, I don't think that should give them special favors from the government. Everyone should be equal under the law. Like you can't buy off a judge. You shouldn't be able to buy off a judge just because you're rich. If you commit a murder, whether you're rich or poor, if you're O.J. Simpson, you commit a murder, then you still go to jail. You can't buy off the judge. I mean, you can try, but then that would be corruption, and you should go to jail for that. And the judge, I guess, maybe he should also go to jail for accepting the bribe. Um, but no, I don't think rich people should have a special say or get any special rights from the government, even if they're contributing more. So it's just up to them to decide, do I want to be donating a ton of money, knowing that I'm not going to be getting special favors from the government by doing that, and they can just make that decision for themselves.
Excuse me. Yeah, I hear it in theory, and I want to support libertarians, and I voted libertarian in 2016. Like, I get it. But over the years, it's like young me would have got it, but it's just like I don't understand. Maybe once the debt's paid, maybe once the debt's paid, I could see it, but I just don't understand it right now. Like, I get that. I get that nobody wants to pay taxes, but that's kind of our responsibility. That's
Yeah.
that's how I see it. Like we make the money, that's our responsibility. We're giving back. It is the donation. It is not mandatory, unfortunately, or it is not voluntary. Excuse me. It is mandatory, but people don't pay taxes all the time, and whether that's right or wrong, and whether they should go to jail or not, whatever. But they don't pay taxes all the time, and they have to deal with those consequences. So there is the freedom. They just have to deal with the consequences, just like with everything else. We have the freedom to do the things that we want to do. There are just not freedom from consequences from those actions. And so I get it, but I also just don't see where I don't think rich people are going to, or the people who are hire the most expensive attorneys in the world in order to pay as little taxes as they can right now, with taxes being mandatory or the threat of prison. I don't think they're going to all of a sudden start donating more just because they don't have to pay taxes. I think they're just going to fire their accountant, and they just cut their staff and their taxes. They cut their payroll and their taxes at the same time. So I hear what you're trying to say, but I just don't think I disagree with that, and I don't know that could, I don't know what I could be. I don't know that anything could sell me that would change.
Mhm. I think we might be kind of coming at this in a midstream sort of way. Like we're imagining if we cut out taxes today, like what would be the immediate consequences? But so much, I mean, this is the world would be radically different if we didn't have taxes. Like there wouldn't be trillion-dollar programs like Social Security that had to be funded. Um, as I was mentioning, the government would be radically smaller. So you wouldn't even need all the taxes that we pay today. Even the things that like the military, we wouldn't be fighting wars like the wars in Afghanistan where we go there and engage in these nation building projects. Maybe we'll go there to, destroy some terrorist bases, but we'll get in, we'll get out. We're not going to be there for 20 years and then end up with the Taliban comes back into power and we're basically at the same point we were 20 years prior, having lost thousands of lives and wasted billions of dollars. So if we had a rational foreign policy where we're only what I think of as a rational foreign policy where we're only engaging in wars of self-defense and not altruistically trying to build sewers or infrastructure or whatever for other nations, then I think there's much less to fund. And also, I think people are going to be much less likely to attack us in the first place if we have a good foreign policy because we'll project strength, peace through strength. I think that's a real thing, but I think our foreign policy has been terribly weak for many decades, and it's led to things like 9/11. I mean, back in the 90s, they tried to blow up the Twin Towers in 93 or 94, I think it was. And I think bin Laden might have been associated with that, but we didn't catch him then. We waited for several more years to go by, and then they attacked the Twin Towers again. And oil has been nationalized by some of these Middle Eastern countries, and they've been allowed to grow rich as a result of this, and then use it to fund terrorism around the world. And I think all that could have been nipped in the bud, and we could have had a much more peaceful and safer world. So I don't think even military has to be nearly as expensive as it is now if we had a good foreign policy. So this is just kind of another angle on why I think it is practical to have no taxes. But what I'm saying is it has to come along with a lot of other things, like a good foreign policy, and of course a good domestic policy as well. And if you do all of these things together, then I think it does start to seem more practical. But if you just take this one element, no taxes, out of context, and don't consider all the other aspects of the sort of society that I or Ayn Rand envisions, then it can seem less practical. So I would grant that.
Now that makes sense, and I hear what you're saying that you can't take it out of context. That it's not. It is more than just let's take away taxes. It's also let's create a better world at the same time, and I understand that, but I also, I still have to question. It goes back to my point about messaging, right? Like we don't have the messaging right now for that. So while 9/11 did happen, the reason we went to Afghanistan was because of the response to 9/11, of course, but because of what George Bush said and what they said, his administration said. They have weapons of mass destruction. We went based on that. And
Well, that was
so,
Iraq, right? Not Afghanistan.
well, you get my point, is that all of the invasion in general, right? All of those wars in general going into the Middle East were based on being there, based on that. And so I thought that was the see, I don't even understand why we were in Afghanistan. Because that was the invasion of Iraq was for 9/11. So what the heck were we doing there? And so you're
The
right that
invasion of Afghanistan was from 9/11. The Iraq was because allegedly Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Uh, and but that was 2 years later, right? So the
yeah, maybe I miss I always get that period so wild. I was also really young then. But
uh,
my point, I guess, is that we went we did more. You're right that we or the military spends money unnecessarily, but we went based on just like you used the American Revolution, based on what he was selling. And I don't think that's going to go away. Even if you take away taxes, there are still going to be people who are willing to pay for those types of things, who are willing to fund those types of things. So it goes back to my other question that I asked. Do those types of does this money still go through Congress? So does Congress still take all of the donations, take all of the money that it's still the same tax policy, right? They're still appropriating money, but they're just appropriating money from a different source. Is that what you're is it, am I understanding that correctly?
well, first of all, there would be a Congress. So this is not one of the three functions I mentioned before, the police, military, and the courts.
Sure.
So there would be a Congress and a legislature, but that would also be funded by voluntary means. Um, as for so if there's an attack on the country, then politicians, but it doesn't have to just be politics. It could be anyone. And now we've got social media, so everyone has a voice. They can jump on social media and say, we need to attack these people who attacked us. And you could have organizations, individuals who are using their voice on whatever platforms are available to them to get out their message and say, let's raise money for this cause. You have individuals and organizations right now who may raise money for all kinds of causes, whether it's curing cancer or helping, starving people in Africa or whatever. And another cause could be, let's fund this war. Look, these people are, firing rockets at our nation, if you're Israel, or look, we got attacked on 9/11 by this terrorist cell, which is based in Afghanistan. So let's go attack them. Um, so I don't think it's that there is a huge amount of support for the war against the Taliban and Bin Laden's people after 9/11. I mean, the nation rallied around uh, this cause. I don't think it was that hard. I mean, this was the worst assault on our country, arguably in its entire history, or maybe if you want to count Pearl Harbor since then. But there was a huge amount of support for war. But unfortunately, I think it waned over time, uh, and eventually support was lost, or at least it wasn't as enthusiastic. I think maybe we could talk more about why that is, but I don't think there was inappropriate response. It wasn't just get in, get out, destroy the enemy. It was let's go engage in nation building and spend billions and billions of dollars over many years. So this is not a war of self-interest, I would say. Likewise, I think it's arguable, or I think it could be argued that we shouldn't have gone to Iraq at all. It would be better, or at least it would have been better to go to a place like Iran, because I think that's the fountainhead of Islamic terrorism. That's the real spiritual source of energy. I mean, they're funding these proxy groups, Hezbollah and Hamas around the world to engage in terrorism. And they took our hostages back in, or they took hostages back in 1979, and we didn't have a good response to that. They held them for over a year, and we should have declared war at that point, but we didn't. We didn't have a strong response, and then it's led to um, we paid the consequences by having these acts of terrorism for decades since then. So that's kind of rambled a bit here. Your original question was like, would it be Congress funding it in the same way, but in a voluntary rather than coercive way? I think yes, but I think it's not that hard to do if it's clear that someone is attacking us, like on 9/11, the country will see that and can rally around that. It will be willing to devote their money to it. And some people, they even joined the military. You know, they're going to devote more than their money. They're going to risk their lives to defend our country. So I think people, if they do see a clear threat, um, they will join the cause to deal with it.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I guess I'm just so, but Congress is still the one who's going to be the one appropriating money, who's going to be deciding where the money that's coming in was coming in through taxes, but now coming in however else, they're still going to be the ones deciding. Is that
Well, yeah, but you know, we vote our politicians into and out of office. So if they're making decisions on what to do with the money that the voters don't like, then you can vote them out of office in the next term.
But I feel like that's the same thing today. Like I feel like we're not doing anything differently. We're just getting the money from a different way. Or we're just and even then you could argue that we're not even getting the money because I don't I'd have to see I don't know what I would have to see in order to believe that people would pay if they didn't have to. Like people currently have to pay now and they don't pay. I don't believe not all people. Not all people. There are people that I guess that's the data that we could see, right? How many people currently don't pay taxes? And then you probably extrapolate that number if they to include then some people who if they didn't if it were, that they weren't being threatened with jail, they wouldn't pay taxes. But regardless, Congress is still going to be the ones who decide where the money goes. And Congress is the issue. Congress is what really needs to be reformed. Do you think we need term limits for Congress? I know it's kind of coming out of left field, but
Uh-huh. I haven't thought about term limits much. I don't think that's really a fundamental issue. Like I don't think much turns on that. Like there are some offices that are for life, like Supreme Court justices. You know, people have talked about, well, should we have term limits for justices? And they've weighed pros and cons on that. Like you might think they're more beholden to some constituency if they're subject to a vote, or um, well, I guess that's different than term limits, but either way, I don't think that's really a big deal compared to other issues like should people be coerced or not. I think that's more fundamental. So I don't really have a view one way or the other on should there be term limits for people in Congress.
the only reason I ask is because that's what I guess that's what I'm trying to get to is that if we don't change that, if they are still the ones that are deciding where the money goes, then they're just going to spend the money however they see fit or however they want, or they'll still pass the budgets that they want, and then they'll risk getting voted out. But that happens now, and we don't vote them out. It's incredible, actually. Anytime there's something bad happening, we vote out the president and the vice president, but we reelect the people who pass the budgets. Like, have you ever
Well,
thought
they
about
get
that? Like,
voted
that's
in and out too, just like the president and the vice president. Yeah,
sure,
actually, even at a faster rate because they're
sure.
well for the House every 2 years. So
Sometimes every 2 years, and I get that. But I guess what I'm saying is that they like there's like they should be getting voted out together, right? Like if the president and the vice president are considered to be doing a bad job, poor job, then wouldn't the Congress that is been with them passing the laws that the president and vice president are casting a tie-breaking vote on or signing, Like, how are they totally, not uh, uh, totally absolved from any type of negatives that happened during those last 4 years? They should be getting voted out too. So the fact that anybody was reelected while we voted out the incumbent is incredible to me. How can that make any sense if these people are the ones who are passing the laws that the incumbents are signing?
Well, I think they can be voted out, and they are voted out. And of course, then not everyone votes together. So, sometimes votes are split down party lines. Sometimes, you got a few Republicans voting with a majority Democratic votes or vice versa. And it's on an individual case by case basis what people vote for, and people do um, suffer loss of office. Happens all the time. But I think the more fundamental issue is like, what are they voting on? Like, what are the laws? What is the principle behind the laws? Like, there are many things that are voted on that I don't think should be voted on at all. This happens like in state referenda. Um, for example, like, should we raise the property tax to fund the local public school system or something? And then this is put to a vote, and if the majority wants it, it becomes law. So I don't think you should be able to vote to tax people at all. Um, so, or like classic example from ancient Greece, Socrates, the Athenian assembly voted to put him to death because he was allegedly corrupting the youth by going around and having these discussions with people and embarrassing certain prominent citizens by, using his skilled argumentative techniques to show they don't really know what they're talking about. And then he was voted to they voted to put him to death. Like, this is something which I don't think you should have the power to vote on at all. It should, some things are so democracy, if that means just unlimited majority rule, I don't think is a good thing. A limited democracy where it's limited by um, the protection of rights. So, uh, by which I mean, as long as you're not using force against someone, you're free to do what you want. Um, but if you interfere with that and you start coercing people, and whether it's, just arbitrary use of force, you punch someone on the street or shoot them, or if you get together as a voting bloc and decide we're going to vote to enslave, all the black people or all the women or whatever, just because people vote to do this, I don't think that makes it legitimate. So that would be unlimited majority rules or unlimited democracy, where just because you have a group of people voting for something means it becomes law. I think that's wrong. You should have individual rights. No individual should be interfered with coercively. But all kinds of laws do interfere coercively now, and Congress, I don't think, should be even entertaining these sorts of laws. Like, should we have Medicare or expand Medicare? This is all coercive because you're forcing people to fund other people's healthcare. I don't think that's right. Um, so yes, there will be a Congress deciding on things, but again, this is part of the broader package that needs to be considered. And I'm not saying you should be considering this because, it takes a while to get this all out in discussion. You can't think of it all at once. But part of how radically different this society that I envision would be that the sorts of laws that Congress even entertains are going to be radically different than they are now. Um, so let me just stop there because I've been going on for a while and see if you have any thoughts here that you want to throw in.
Yeah, no, and I hear you. And I guess I just wanted to get to the gist of it was that Congress is still going to be the ones deciding where the money goes. And yes, we can vote them out, but that's not different. And though the laws they might be voting on will be different, kind of the setup is the same, right? The
Well,
process
it could
is
be
the
like
same.
there could be something in the constitution of the country that says the money collected by the government will only be spent on the protection of people from force, something like this. So that would be a way of delimiting the power Congress has to decide where the money goes. Now, within that, there could be it could be that Congress has to make further decisions like, okay, yes, we're only going to use it to protect people from force, but are we going to spend $5 billion on this war with country X and 8 billion on the war with country Y? Or are we going to flip it and, do the reverse, 8 billion on the other and 5 billion on the other? That's something that maybe Congress would have the power to decide. And you can't have, unless you have like if you have a representative democracy where you have people representing their constituency instead of 330 million people all getting together and voting one by one on something. If you're going to have a representative system, then I guess there are going to be Congress is going to have more power in a certain way than just any random individual in the society. But I don't see a way around that unless you're going to have everyone getting together, all 330 million people. Maybe it'd be easier if you could electronically do it today. But if you don't see that as practical, like everyone voting on everything, if you think it's better to have a representative system, then I don't really see a way around these particular individuals having more power than everyone else. But at least in the long run, whether it's 2 years or 4 years, they are beholden to their constituency. So there could be some short-term bad things that happen, but you could also put further mechanisms in place, like the fundamental law in the Constitution that says you can only spend money on the protection of people from force. Maybe you could refine that, add some amendments over time that make it harder and harder for um, for individual Congress people to just arbitrarily, whimsically spend money on their pet projects or pet interests. I don't know what other refinements you could have, but you could tweak the laws over time to deal with problematic issues that come up.
Yeah, I just feel like the Congress people would hire expensive lawyers to make sure all of their laws protected somebody from force. But I want to get to the regulation part because I don't know that we'll see the same on that on taxes. Because I get it, but I don't think that I don't know what the replacement is. I'm just like we what replace it with tariffs, and I get that it comes as a comprehensive plan of having good foreign policy, having good domestic policy, but we don't have that. So if we're not talking about like something that's like going to be an immediate type of solution, then that's what I'm trying to see. My son just got here, but I do want to get the regulations specifically on like 9/11 because you were talking about that, and then we had the FAA. But do you mind if I take a quick break here? Just
No
say what's
problem.
up to my son. I just walked in. Hold on a sec.
That's fine. You're back.
Hey there. Yeah, sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, yeah. So talk to me about regulation because you like what is I'm assuming it's not zero regulation.
It is zero. But it's important to understand what I mean by regulations. So, what I mean is laws that initiate force against people. So, I wouldn't say a law against murder is a regulation. That's just a legitimate law because a law against murder is a law that says you can't initiate force against someone. You can't take their life without their consent. Maybe if it's assisted suicide, then you could put the person to death because you've had their consent. But murder is doing something without their consent. So a law against murder would be a way of protecting people from force, from things happening against their will, against their consent. Um, so a law against murder is retaliatory force. It's stopping someone who does initiate force. But uh, a regulation, by contrast, would be a law that itself initiates force. For instance, the minimum wage law, I would call a regulation because that's a law that's saying we're going to force you to pay a certain amount, even if you were perfectly willing to be hired for 14 bucks an hour, and the employer was willing to pay you 14 bucks an hour. So that was a voluntary agreement you had with somebody. That was all voluntary. There was no force at all. It was all consensual. But the government says no. We're going to forcibly stop this transaction from happening. You have to pay them $15 an hour, or we're going to close down your business or fine you or put you in jail or whatever. But so that's what I would call a regulation. So anytime the law is initiating force and not just stepping in and using force to retaliate against other people, then I would call it a regulation. And I think all laws like that are initiating force are bad and should be outlawed.
So would there be a law that says you have to charge any amount?
Nope. Your business, you run it however you want, as long as you're not forcing anyone.
So even if but they couldn't be necessarily working for nothing, even if they signed up for it, right? Like unless they signed up to be a volunteer. Unless they signed up to be a volunteer, sure. But if they signed up to work for nothing, or if they just are
Well,
working for nothing,
it'd be a weird contract. I mean, you could say a contract that says, I'm going to work for $0 an hour, but then it's basically saying I agree to be a volunteer.
well,
But
sure. Well, I guess that's where it gets tricky because it's like, okay, so they're not forcing them, but then who's regulating the business? Because you say that there's still government. So there's still OSHA, there's still what, the
no,
FTC. There's no OSHA, there's no
all these
FTC.
alphabet agencies are gone.
So all the FTC, all of the FAA, everybody that's regulating right now will be gone. And so
Yeah.
if a business does decide to charge somebody and say, hey, I'm going to pay you, you know, $0, or they write the contract, or they don't even give them a contract. It's just, it's just a verbal agreement. Right? I didn't sign a contract when I went to go work at McDonald's, or anything like that. Like you typically just, here's your I-9, and we'll see you on Tuesday. And so what is the, like they have no recourse, like the people have no recourse, I guess, is the people, it's not they don't have any recourse, I should say. We are relying on people's self-intelligence to protect themselves in your society, is what you're saying. It's that you're no longer, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I want to be clear, that's basically what you're saying, is that people who like people would have to get smarter and actually read the fine print in your society, because there would be no protection if you get it wrong.
There would be of a certain sort. Um, I mean, if you are wronged, if you just say if you get something wrong, well, maybe sometimes you just have to suffer the consequences if you're not careful. Um, if you don't do your research on some product you buy, you might end up buying some inferior product, and you just have to accept that. You can't really take it out on anyone else. Um, but I mean, a business can't engage in fraud legally. Like if it promises you something, like you go to a grocery store, and it says, there are 100 calories in this food that I'm selling you, but it turns out there's 1,000 calories in it, so it's mislabeled. Well, that would be a case of fraud where they're just lying to you and they're giving you something on false pretenses. Like you paid them money in exchange for something that they were pretending had only 100 calories when in fact it had 1,000. So they tricked you out of your money, and you could take them to court over that. That would be a way of fraud. It's kind of an indirect form of force. You're still doing something without someone's consent, because what the person consented to was a product that only had 100 calories, and they gave you money on that premise that it had only 100. But if it turns out it had 1,000, then you took their money on false pretenses, and that's fraud, which is doing something against their will without their consent. So you can still prosecute businesses for engaging in fraud, but that's a form of force. So that still falls within the general principle I have of you can do any kind of business you want as long as you're not coercing or forcing someone. Um, but all these regulatory agencies are that engage in initiating force. They create these rules that people are forced to follow without their consents. Then when they it, so if they force people to do things who haven't forced anyone else, and that's what I oppose. And I think all those agencies that create these regulations should be gotten rid of.
So not necessarily the FTC, because the
Well,
FTC
it
would,
might depend on what exactly the FTC's rules are. Like maybe there's some rules that the FTC has come up with that don't involve initiating force, and those can be legitimate laws that should stay on the books. But maybe there are other laws. I'm not very familiar with exactly what the laws are that the FTC comes up with, but it could be that some things they do are legit and others aren't. But maybe a different, maybe Congress should be coming up with these laws rather than some other agency that isn't beholden to voters or funders of governments. Um, so
I
well,
don't disagree
I'll
with
just
that.
pause there.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I guess more so I'm just trying to figure out, like, because fraud is, it's kind of like, it's kind of again a gray area, because once the fraud happens, then it's a police matter, right? They're going to investigate it. So would the police be investigating business fraud and multiple like large cases of business fraud? If a company is defrauding people or their employees, and people are like, who do the people then go to in order to report this, in order to report their company? That's kind of where I'm getting to. I'm like, do they go to the police? Is everything now just, not that it shouldn't be, again, not that I disagree that it shouldn't be a police matter, but is everything now reported then to the police, or you just have to go to court and hire a lawyer to fight their lawyer on every issue, and good luck? Is that how it works, or what?
I'm not sure, but it could be both of those things. Like maybe in some cases, if you suspect fraud, you file a lawsuit and you handle it through the courts. Maybe there are other sorts of cases of fraud where you would go to the police and they would send over a private investigator, or maybe not a private investigator, a police investigator to look into it more. So there could be different ways of handling it.
And even if you don't pay for the police department, you could still call the police.
Yeah. So this is a case where there might be some free riders and um, maybe or maybe not, depending on the circumstances, it could be appropriate to somehow distance yourself from someone who tries to like boycotting, ostracizing this sort of person who tries to get these government services without contributing anything in return. But yeah, I think there would be at least a baseline level of protection from the police that anyone would get, whether they've contributed or not. And then if you want more, if you want to have a bunch of like private security or investigators, then you could hire them specially. Um,
Not part of the police department, just, separate, like you said, separate. That's,
yeah,
you're not paying for additional, you know, Metro Police Department officers to hang out at your house. You you're paying for Joe LLC security, whatever.
yeah.
Correct? Is that what you're saying? When you say pay extra, like they're not paying for the local police department to guard them. They're paying for separate police.
Right.
Okay. I just want to be, I don't want the people who are paying into it to be also paying for somebody to get more police, because then it just feels like also you're
Mm.
getting less police. Because, but like you said, that's not the case. So still, okay. So regulation would be, there would be regulation, if, as long as it's preventing, as long as it's not forcing people to do things. What about forcing people to, like
I
before
wouldn't
they
call
get
it
on the,
regulation then. I would just call it laws. So I like to say the no regulations, but I define regulations as laws that initiate force against people. So there would be laws, but not laws that initiate force, which is what I mean by regulations. So there would be no regulations, but there would be laws.
there would be no laws that initiate force. So there would be no
Yeah.
laws that make people do things, what'd you say, that unconsensual physical,
Yeah,
uh,
that it involve unconf So the
It's
definition of force I gave or coercion was unconsensual contact with someone's person or property.
Gotcha. So not, what about getting searched before getting onto an airplane?
Um, let's see. I guess well, for one thing, I think airlines should be private, and unlike Amtrak, this is a government train service. I think trains and airplanes, all transportation, I think these should be private. So I guess the airline, the private airline would have to come up with a rule. Maybe it would be different. Like maybe some airlines would say if you want to fly our planes, you've got to be searched before you get on them. Other airlines would say no, you don't have to be searched, and people could just vote with their wallets. What kind of airline do I want to fly on? And you fly on the airline of your choice. But I think it would be a regulation if the government stepped in and said, you airlines, no matter what you want personally, you have to search everybody before they get on your plane. That would be a regulation because they're forcing the airline business to comply with some law, even though the airline hasn't forced anyone else. So it wouldn't be a case of retaliatory force. So I wouldn't give a blanket answer as to whether airlines would search people. I would just say leave it up to the private decisions of the airlines. It's their freedom of choice as to how it operates.
So that would change how air travel works today, is what you're saying. Is
Yeah, it would be much different.
you would not have, if people want to get on a plane with a bunch of guns or bombs or whatever the case may be, then if that's what they can afford, that's what they'll fly. Versus if they can afford a more expensive plane where they search people and don't allow people on board with planes or don't check identification or don't, I guess they would still have to check that because that's not necessarily well, yeah, no, it's still forcing. Well, it's not forcing because it's not just because you're asking to see their identification. It's not by your definition of force. Uh, so they would still have to see identification. They'd still have to be who they say they are when they travel, but they can travel whatever they want on certain airlines if that airline allows it. And there wouldn't be any law or rule that uh, prevented the airline from allowing that. Interesting. Interesting.
There might even be airlines that don't check identification. Like I was just thinking, like there are in some cities they have a trolley that goes around. You can just step on the trolley just randomly, and really like in San Diego, I know there's a trolley or a tram that goes around the city, and you don't get inspected before you get on, or just a
Sure.
bus, any public transportation. Anyone can just get on, and they're not checking your ID. You get on, you get off. No one's checked you. And there might be airlines like that. And this is part of how radically different society would be. I think there would be much less um, danger of terrorists and hijacking things in this kind of world. Part of the larger context or package that I envision, but it might be that there are some airlines that you can just step on and step off, and they don't even check your ID.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not going to happen or it's not. I mean, of course, I'd want that to happen, but I just feels, I don't know, it feels a little backwards. Like, what are we, like, isn't that the whole point? We want to know who's traveling where so that if something does happen, we can investigate it? Or is it just, hey, if somebody does, let's say, not to say that there aren't going to be any hijackings, but if there is, we don't know who got on the plane. We don't know. So then it's just that airline takes a dive. Like it's the airline's fault. It's not necessarily the government's fault, even if the airline, like just let's just say 9/11 happens again in your society or the one that you're envisioning. If something like that happened in your society, it wouldn't be necessarily the fault of the government because the government would be regulating things like that. It would have been XYZ airline that wasn't checking IDs or that allowed their plane to get hijacked, even though it resulted in the loss of thousands of American lives. Is that
Yeah, it would at least be partly the fault of the airline. Um, Now I think it would be, I don't know how many years or decades before it would get to the point where I personally, like if I'm running an airline, I would want to know who's on it, and I wouldn't let people just randomly get on. So once society got to a point where it seemed like it was going much better, things were much more peaceful, then you would feel more comfortable as an airline operator allowing people to just randomly come on your plane, like any business. You walk into a random restaurant these days, they just allow people at random. They're just open to the public, and
sure?
maybe society would get to a point where airlines felt comfortable enough doing that. But there still might be just because people, I think, they have free will and they can act irrationally on their own. You might have, even in a great society, much better than the one that exists today. Um, you still might have evil people who do evil things, and you can't 100% rule that out. But I don't think it's right for the government to coerce people because maybe if a tiny percentage of people are evil and do evil things, but people put through time, the free market can evolve mechanisms to make it less likely that evil people can do evil things. So with freedom, I think comes more wealth and innovation and progress. So you can have things like video cameras. Maybe if you don't charge people to get on the plane, um, we might be so wealthy as a society that they don't even have to charge people. It's just a free service that some people provide. Um, and maybe even if it's free to get on the plane, they would still have security cameras in case something does go wrong. If someone starts to act suspiciously, you could see them on a camera and then take action to prevent a possible hijacking. So it's not that there would be no mechanisms in place at all to deal with evil actors, but whatever mechanisms they're going to be free market mechanisms. They're not going to be imposed by some government coercing a business to do things to make its passengers feel safer. I mean, the airline has an incentive for its passengers to feel safe and to actually be safe. I mean, if things like hijackings happen, then I'm going to be less likely to use this airline. I'm going to want an airline that puts in place measures that makes me feel confident that it's going to be a safe flight.
Yeah, I agree with that. But at the end of the day, privately owned businesses have a responsibility to their shareholders first. Like, as much as, yes, it makes sense to keep people safe, they're going to do as little as possible to do that. And while I do agree that just because the government can impose more restrictions and regulations in order to make a private business kind of make their travel safer, I don't think they should in all scenarios. I don't think travel is one of those. I think travel is one of those where we need. When I think about the federal intervention, I think about anything that goes state to state, anything that can go state to state or affects somebody else without them, without them being involved. Right? 9/11, that was a federal problem because it affected people that didn't matter. Didn't matter if you got on a plane that day, you got affected. Anything that affects all of us without us really having to be involved in it. And so I think that's that's what I think the responsibility of the government lies in protecting us from things like that. And so I think travel, especially air travel, maybe not domestic travel, and I don't think there is a lot of uh, like some of these regional airports. It is very lax. You know, the ones that aren't going international or they aren't going state to state, you're just going whatever. But I think if you're going from state to state, you're traveling the country especially you got minors getting on planes. Like, I understand it might take some time, but if it's going to take time to implement, then it's not a solution that we're talking about today. So we're not going to remove the FAA today. We're not going to remove, what is it, TSA today. So what are we like? I don't understand how I'm just trying to figure out how we solve problems, how we still solve the problems, how we still fund the government without taxes, and how we still prevent things that we know can happen. While it might be a small percentage of people, we can prevent it from happening. Why wouldn't we? Why would we rely on private businesses that, I mean, we know we've seen how many bailouts now? The auto industry, the banking industry, like we've seen all of these bailouts for these private industries. They never put their people first. They always put themselves and their shareholders, and they get the golden parachute, and then they get bailed out. So I want to believe in your society that, yeah, like, yes, people would pay taxes if they even if they didn't have to. Maybe pay more. Maybe we'd have more money. Um, I mean, I don't think people should just have to pay taxes for no reason. I don't think people should have to pay necessarily in Social Security and not be able to get it until they're what, 65? Like, paying is something that they're never really going to be able to use, and it's going to be what, $2,000 a month. And so I get all of that, but I also feel like sometimes it's like solution from, I think you said you're not really a libertarian, but the solution from libertarians is like sometimes it's not reasonable. It doesn't feel reasonable. And I can't, I'm trying to get there. Like, hopefully you can tell, like, I want to understand. Like, that's probably my biggest thing. Like, I want to be an understanding
Mhm.
person. Like, I want to get where people are coming from. I'm just like, I don't get it. Like, I don't get where the money would come from. Like, I get it, but I don't believe it. Like, I don't believe like that would actually happen.
Well, one thought I have on this is the order of putting into like how you get from where we are today to the society I envision. That might be very complicated to figure out what is a good um, step-by-step process to get there. So I wouldn't necessarily say first step is get rid of taxes or get rid of the FAA or the
Sure.
FTC. Like maybe you do some taxes and some of the regulations of the FTC and some of the FDA or FAA, but not
Sure.
others. And then
Mm.
it can be extremely complex on what the steps are getting there. And I don't claim, I don't know that anyone can claim to have worked it all out. And I don't know that there's any totally painless way to get there after all the damage that I think has been done. Like if you metaphorically, if a knife has been stuck in to someone, which I like metaphorically, the knife is the taxes and regulations, and I think we should pull the knife out, right? Get rid of all these taxes. It might hurt to pull that knife out. Maybe it feels better, or at least less worse, to just leave it sticking in there for a while. But if you do that, it would be much worse in the long run than if you pulled it out. So there might be some pain on, getting rid of that knife, but you got to do it. And so I guess I'm in most of my conversations with people, I'm just concerned with the getting the ultimate goal as a point of agreement. Like if we can agree we should get the knife out. In other words, less metaphorically, if we can get to a point where there's no coercion in society, then that would be great. That's what we want to aim at. Now, exactly how we do that, do we want to like use a tranquilizer or anesthetic or something? And exactly what are the steps by which we get there? That's a very long and complicated conversation, but do we at least agree on the ultimate goal? Like a lot of times, I think we don't even agree on the ultimate goal. So there's not even a point on having the conversation on how we get there. We have different ideas of where we should get. So I guess that would be the first thing I would want to establish with someone is like, do you think we should at least get to a society of no coercion? Is that your ultimate goal? If yes, then we can talk about how do we get there. If no, then let's rather focus on the ultimate goal and whether or not it's good to have a society like that of no coercion.
Yeah, I mean, and I yes and no. Like I get that. I just don't think that there won't be any coercion. Like I, I think we've talked about it briefly, right? I think there's still going to be some gray area coercion where it's like, okay, you're not supporting the police and it's voluntary, but we used to have voluntary team meetings, but they were mandatory. The only reason they weren't mandatory is that we were independent contractors, and you can't say it's mandatory. But you took away some things, right? Well, you're not gonna be able to do X, Y, or Z if we don't make the meeting. You do certain things, or it's like it's basically the same. It's basically the same. It's not, you're not saying it's mandatory, you're not forcing it on somebody, but you're basically, you know, coercing them in the gray area version, not necessarily your definition, but in that gray area version, to do what you want them to do. So that's kind of where I get it. I get that. Yes, maybe we should take the knife out, but I don't think we should take the knife out until we're to a point where we could like wrap it, right? Where we could stop the bleeding, where we're at the hospital. Like I don't want to take the knife out just to take the knife out, and then we got a part guy that's just bleeding out, and we don't have like a plan. I don't want to take the knife out before we have a plan, and that's what I
Hmm.
kind of. And I get that you have the plan, but I don't necessarily believe the plan. I don't believe the plan is going to work. That's what's
Well,
hard.
I don't really have a plan on uh, how to get to a state where there's no taxes and regulations. It's just I want to get there. Like, so for example, like Social Security is a case where I don't think we should just abolish it now. I think it should be phased out over years. So, for example, like people who are just about to retire or maybe already have retired, they get all the benefits they've been promised, right? If they've been getting monthly payments of, let's say, $2,000 a month, they continue to get that. Um, but if you're just starting to work, let's say you're 18, you're just about to start your first job, those people, I think, shouldn't be forced to pay anything into Social Security, and they shouldn't expect anything from it once they retire. They've got to know that now they've got to start planning for their retirements, maybe set up a retirement fund, 401k, some private thing, and they're going to be entirely responsible. Now, if you're somewhere in the middle, let's say you're 45 years old, maybe that person, they've been paying into the system for a while, and so maybe they'll get I don't know, 70% of what they were promised originally, and the rest they're responsible on their own. So there can be a graduated scale, a continuum. Um, so this would be an example of how I think you would phase something out over time, and you would ultimately get to the point where there's no coercion at all. So like in 100 years, no, there's not going to be any Social Security at all. No government mandated retirement program. People are just going to be entirely responsible. But for maybe a few decades, there will still be Social Security, but it will be in a diminishing amount. And that would be a way to get from point A to point B. And you would have to do this with all kinds of programs, with education and um, I don't know, public roads, all the things the government does. Maybe you would have to phase them out over a course of years or decades. Maybe some you could just abolish overnight. They're just so superfluous. I don't know what would be a good example of that. But maybe others, they take much longer to phase out in a reasonable kind of way. But I haven't thought all that through by any means.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying. It's just hard. It's still hard just because it's like, okay, yeah, it sounds good in theory. You just tell the people now that they don't have to pay them Social Security and they won't get it, which is the truth, right? Unfortunately, people that are paying into it probably aren't going to get it anyway. So I agree with that stance. Unfortunately, though, how do we continue paying the people that are getting $2,000 a month, $2,000 a month, if part of that $2,000 a month is coming from the people who are paying into it that aren't going to get it yet? That's kind of where I'm like, okay, well, yeah, we could pull the knife out, but we haven't stopped the bleeding. And we're still just going to, then we just create another problem. The same problem we're in right now, where we're worried about Social Security being able to be funded. They would just speed it up.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any totally painless way to get from point A to point B, where point B is the knife is out, um, because there's just been so much damage done, um, that's there might just be no perfect or painless way to do it. But does that mean we should just leave the system as it is?
I don't
Or
necessarily think that. I don't necessarily think that at all. I just want to have an idea, though. I just want to have a, I feel like I want to have a plan. And I feel like it's hard because of what you're saying. Like the longer it takes, the worse it gets, the harder it's going to be to kind of do it. And then even by the time you get to it, where you're ready to do it, now everything that you've been kind of negotiating on is different. It's like it's like widening the highway. By the time they get done with it, it needs to be widened again because they didn't expect the population growth that happened in between. And so I get that there's never going to be a great time or the right time, um, but I feel like if we're going to do it, then I would feel more comfortable with any type of monetary policy change. I feel like we need a balanced budget first because the debt's not going to go away. But I think you and I can at least agree we're going to make less, the government would bring in less revenue if we didn't have coercive taxes. Would you agree with that statement? It's like the government would bring in less revenue without coercive taxes, or do you believe they would bring in more revenue?
I don't know actually. I was just thinking that if there were no regulations, yet the taxes were kept the same, I think there would be more tax revenue because without the regulations, I think businesses would be so much more productive that they would generate so much more revenue that's, if you tax them at the same rates, they're going to be paying much more so in taxes because they're making so much more. So instead, if a company is now making $1 billion in revenue and they have to pay 20% in taxes, corporate taxes, if because of lack of regulations, they're now making $5 billion in revenue, yet they're still paying 20% corporate tax. Now they're paying 5 times more in taxes just because they're so much wealthier as a business. So I think it's possible that something like that could happen, but I just don't know
But
for sure.
but in your scenario, there wouldn't be a 20% corporate tax.
Yeah. So right, there's not going to be any taxes, at least ultimately, in the system I envision.
So whether
Um,
they go from 1 billion in revenue to or 5 billion in revenue, they still get to decide how much they want to pay in taxes.
well, there's not going to be taxes if that means coercively, like mandated payments to the government. If you just mean contributions to the government, um, then they're going to be free to pay from $0 to as much as they want. I mean, there is no limit. It's entirely up to them.
I guess that's my question then, is that do you believe that the government would bring in more of that type of revenue? In your society, do you think they'd bring in more revenue than they bring in today with coercive taxes?
I don't know, but I think whatever revenue I think they'll bring in enough, like as is needed for the three basic functions that I mentioned, police, military, and courts, because I think those are clearly in people's self-interest. Like if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, or even if you're just a small business owner, you don't want robbers and rapists and murderers running around the streets and, looting your business and stealing your stuff and destroying your property. You want a safe society to live in and to run your business in. So it's in so many people's interests to have these functions that I think they're going to be willing to pay. As I said, with George Washington's case, you had a voluntary army. The people are going to risk their lives to have a good society. Well, if they're going to risk their lives, they're certainly going to risk some of their money, I think. So I think it's in people's interest to fund the government. So I don't know how much it's going to be that they donate, but I think it's going to be enough. And if they sense like we're still not safe enough, we don't have enough police on the streets to keep us safe, they're going to up their contributions or they're buying of lottery tickets or whatever the means of funding the government is until it gets to a point that they now feel they're adequately protected from criminals.
I gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I disagree. I
Mhm.
disagree that we're going to bring in more, like that we bring in more revenue than we brought in right now with coercive taxes. But again, I don't think
Well, I
it's
didn't
worth
say we would. I just said I think we
that. You're
bring
not
enough
sure.
revenue to protect from the criminals,
Ooh, mm,
whatever that is.
well,
Maybe it turns out to be less revenue overall than now, but there would
well,
be,
sure.
I mean, so much of what the government does now, it's not going to be doing in my society. So, like the whole public education system, Social Security, and Medicare, all that's going to be out. So maybe it's most reasonable to think the government is going to be taking in much less money because doesn't have to fund all these multi-billion dollar or trillion dollar programs. They don't exist to fund anymore. So it
That's my
needs much
point.
less money. But the money it does bring in is going to be just protecting people from force, and but that's all it needs. So there's no need for a trillion dollars of money coming into the government.
Well, that's I guess what I'm getting to, and I do have to wrap. I want to help with the kiddo here, but the point I guess I'm trying to make, and you can kind of hit me with your 2 minute wrap up as well. But th- if we if the government isn't going to, or is going to just bring in the same amount or less than what we're currently bringing in, then we're not going to be able to pay down our debt. And so our debt's not just going to disappear. And so in order to get to even to consider a society that has certainly no taxes, but even a society like the one that Donald Trump is proposing with increased tariffs and getting rid of all types of taxes and lowering taxes, like that's insane to me to think about lowering taxes, lowering revenue while we have a debt crisis. Like that's pulling the knife out before we have a solution. And so while I'd love to keep more money. Yes, I don't want to pay any taxes for sure. I'd love it if I didn't have to get stripped or show ID to get on a plane. All that sounds great, but to me, none of it is even. It's not even a conversation starter until we pay down our debt, and we can't do that. In my mind, we cannot do that. And like in any other tax structure, I'd love to consider it, and I feel like I've tried to like understand how it would work, but I just don't see it. Like I don't think it would. But give me your 2 minute spiel, and then I got a jet.
Uh-huh. Okay. So this gets to the issue of what is the best order in which to get to the kind of society I envision. So I do think the debts is perhaps it's best to keep taxes as they are, or maybe simplify them vastly. Maybe you could do that at least instead of having a huge tax code with all these complicated loopholes and whatever. Um, make it much more simple. Even if you end up bringing in the same amount of revenue through taxes, just simplify it. Um, but maybe the better thing to do, or the prior thing to do than getting rid of taxes is getting rid of regulations. Maybe not all at once, but start to peel back um, regulations so that society is much more productive. Businesses earn much more money and are much more innovative. And then after you get the increased productivity gains, then maybe you're in a position to start paying down that debt. And then over time, maybe over decades, it becomes more and more reasonable to start getting rid of the taxes as well and ratchet back down to zero eventually. Maybe it'll take 50 years. I don't know. Um, but eventually get there. But I think maybe regulations is a better place to start. I think there's probably a lot of regulations which could be gotten rid of, if not overnight, very fast. yet would make a huge difference in terms of enabling businesses to be more productive and innovative and generate more wealth in society. So, I guess I will leave it there. Um,
Yeah, it's a good place to leave
thanks a
it too.
lot for coming on. I really appreciate the discussion.
No, I appreciate you. I agree 100% with what you said, by the way. I think regulation, you've got an argument. Like I could be sold on that. I believe in regulation, especially ones that keep us safe, like like safety regulations. I think we should keep probably OSHA and some of the other ones that like the building regulations. I think the elevators, like I don't want to never go to an elevator again because there's no regulations. But I think that over regulation also is a thing. So, but yeah, I think that's reasonable for sure.
All right, we will leave it there. So I will bring this to a close. Thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you. I appreciate you and inviting me and reaching out. And if you ever want to chat some more, hit me up.
All right, sounds good. Bye bye.
All right, see ya.